Okay, so a bit impromptu. Let me just check. I've got my yes. Okay, welcome one and all to an impromptu discussion with the Glasgow Cathcart and Pollock constituent candidate and list candidate in the forthcoming May election, the Scottish election, Yvonne Ridley. Hello, Yvonne.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me onto your show.
You're welcome. It's our show because we're just making it up as we go along. Right, so Yvonne, you are the Workers' Party candidate for Glasgow Cathcart and Pollock, is that correct?
That is correct.
How have you been finding the campaign thus far? We're into the last few days before the vote on Thursday.
Well, it's been rather strange. I've stood in other elections before south of the border, but usually when you get to the final countdown, which we're in now, you know, days away from the actual vote, people are usually excited. You usually see political colours flying from lampposts and posters in people's windows. But there's absolutely nothing this time round. The biggest winner so far is apathy.
Yeah.
And especially among the older generation, I'm alarmed that most of the youth that I've spoken to, they've only heard of reform. Which shows the benefits or value of the TikTok and social network campaigns, because we all know that reform is not short of a penny or two, and they have been focusing hard on the social networks, and it's obviously very effective with the youth.
Yeah, they definitely dominate the TikTok platform, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is a big achievement to them. Whatever we think of their politics, whatever we think of them as individuals, or the lack of their politics, or whatever they do or don't represent.
Yes,
it's a big achievement, and it exposes the complacency of the other parties, or perhaps you might even consider the entitlement, perhaps, of parties like the SNP, maybe Labour to an extent in Scotland, for not sharpening their game in that respect.
Well, they're, all for chapping on the doors, and in the current climate, nobody wants to answer the front door, because a knock at the front door usually is the debt collector, or even worse, bailiffs. And so chapping round the doors in my constituency in Glasgow is... It's something that I've gone more for public meetings than knocking on doors.
I think a lot of politicians are reticent to knock on any doors at present. The perception of all politicians at present within the public mind is pretty low. You're certainly going to get an earful from certain people if you chap on the wrong door.
Well, I was at a hustings a couple of weeks ago in a Labour stronghold, and the Labour candidate was booed as he walked into the room, booed on the stage, and booed when he was introduced. And this was in a Labour stronghold, and I've never seen that before. People often jeer or sneer at their politicians, and there's a bit of joshing going on, but this was on a different level. And I think that Labour have become the new Tories as far as Scottish voters are concerned. So to go around with a Labour rosette or a Tory rosette in the current climate is fraught in Scotland, I would say.
Tell me, there's been a lot of if you look at the mainstream and even the sort of pathetic attempts of what we have as supposedly alternative media. The general consensus is that this is the worst election in the history of elections, that the main political parties have nothing to offer, it's profoundly uninspiring. In terms of what the outcome is going to be after the 7th, we'll end up with a massive SNP majority again, or perhaps not majority, but we're going to end up with a massive SNP bunch of parliamentarians. So no real change there. But it's likely that we will have a section of reform in there as well. This is a failure of the incumbent political class, the SNP. Do you agree with that?
I would say that the SNP have a lot to answer for, and they've killed off any enthusiasm for elections. I blame them for the state of politics today. They've made it so uninspiring, so boring, and they've just turned off voters completely. There is nothing in the SNP's handbook that is exciting, or there's no wow factor. And of course, I used to be a member of the SNP, so I could be biased, but I just think that they have a lot to blame for the apathy on the streets. And I was at another hustings recently where I sat next to an SNP candidate. I don't even know his name. It was like sitting next to Mogadon Man. He was just so uninspiring. And interestingly enough, at that hustings, independence was only mentioned once, and that was by me.
Yeah.
It's the whole independence thing is not being talked about by the SNP, which promotes itself as the independence party.
Yeah, it's simply not a priority for them. I think that we know that's the case.
This business of a referendum, they know fine well that they can't have a referendum, and yet they've got the gall to put out there, on day one, we will ask for a referendum. Well, on day one, should they get elected, and as you predict, they probably will, I can tell you about the phone call now. John Swinney will pick up the phone. Can we have a referendum? No, you can't. You know that you can't. Your lawyers have told you you can't. The Supreme Court ruling for the Section 30 said no, so go away. Oh, okay, thank you. And he'll put the phone down and he'll just say, well, I tried. And that will be the extent of the election promise. But what always amazes me is that the SNP supporters who remain in the party do not seem keen to hold the leadership to account. And certainly not in the way that the Lib Dems did when Nick Clegg
reneged on his promises.
The promise of the student pledge. He was, that affected the party for 2 general elections.
Yeah.
Almost destroyed the party because he reneged on a deal. And yet the SNP fans just seem to have this amnesia.
It's very partisan. There's a sort of partisan myopia.
Yes.
That pervades through those that still stick by the SNP, who still are under the mistaken belief that they are going to lead them to anything, really. They're controlled opposition, and I think the British establishment are more than happy to have the SNP in control up here. It suits them down to the ground. And what we need is we need an intervention there, a parliamentary intervention, especially for those who wish to have Scottish independence. Now, the reason I mention this is because like I say, if you look at any of the mainstream media narratives, which I tend to kind of, I don't really have the energy to look at much of that these days. You know, I've been busy with my own campaign as well. But what I have noticed is there is this pervading attitude that basically this is an incredibly tedious, droll election cycle. But the truth is that out with these mainstream parties, there's quite a lot going on. There's quite a lot of activity occurring via independents and smaller parties that are genuinely engaging with the electorate, engaging with the public, and it's actually, if you separate yourself from this very sort of narrow mainstream narrative, it's actually a lot more interesting than I think we're led to believe. This has been my experience. This has been my experience through my own campaigning, speaking to other candidates, speaking to other people who've been campaigning, and even before the campaign started, you were kind enough to invite me along to the George, and you invited me to the Workers' Party launch in Govan, where I gave a small talk about contemporary politics, election politics, and at that talk, one of your candidates, Laura Jones, she gave a very important speech about housing. And this speech on TikTok has now got over 70,000 views and an awful lot of engagement as well. And I thought it was very interesting because it was. We'll look at the speech just in a minute. We'll just look at it. But throughout this whole period, prior to the election, this was maybe a week or two prior to the start of the election cycle, and throughout it, I don't believe Laura's received any coverage from the media in regards to this speech. And I think that's very telling, because these same outlets and whatnot, that are, especially those that represent the so-called alternative media in Scotland, have completely failed to cover Laura's speech. And personally, I believe that's because of a prejudice and a hostility towards the Workers' Party, because George Galloway is the leader of the party, and I think that there's an awful lot of hostility towards George from sections of the Scottish media. And they've allowed that hostility and prejudice to essentially ignore what is, in my opinion, probably one of the most important pieces of political speaking throughout this election thus far. Certainly from the response that I've seen on social media. You know, TikTok is it can be quite a superficial and frivolous medium. It's not really where a lot of serious politics takes place. But then you see a speech like this receiving so much interest and so much attention, you have to take that seriously. You have to look at that and say, well, people are relating to this. The messages, a lot of the private messages that came in on the back of this speech that Laura gave, reiterating, reconfirming her concerns about the Wheatley Group. Many people giving testimony to their own issues that they've had with them. Let's just take a minute to look at this speech that Laura gave, yeah?
Yeah.
So we can broadcast it. Okay, I'll play it here just now. Bear with me while I move my mouse around. Here it is here.
The Wheatley Group is a monster that must be destroyed. We need. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. If you want to know the main reason for the housing crisis in Scotland, you need look no further than the Wheatley Group. The biggest landlord in Europe, it has been steadily snapping up smaller housing associations and now owns a huge proportion of Scotland's public housing and infrastructure. It does not answer to its tenants or to the communities it is supposed to serve. It answers to its shareholders and ultimately to BlackRock. Since the disastrous stock transfer in Glasgow just over 20 years ago, Wheatley has been responsible for the demolition in Glasgow alone of roughly 160,000 social homes. Wheatley's planned redevelopment in the Wynford, paid for with £100 million of public money, involved the demolition of 4 25-storey tower blocks containing 600 social homes and the destruction of our much-loved community centre, to be replaced with 350 mid-market rent properties to increase Wheatley's rental income. The Wynford Residents' Union, with the support of the Scottish Tenants Organisation, fought these plans, and immediately Wheatley went on the attack, employing every conceivable weapon to crush resistance to their plans. Corporate espionage, including the clever application of identity politics, police intimidation, propaganda, fake public consultations, and even bribing community members and sectarian and racist thugs to turn members of the community against each other. Despite these attacks, we fought a 4-year battle with Wheatley, who had millions of pounds at their disposal and the backing of the SNP and the Scottish Greens to pump tens of thousands of tonnes of carbon into the atmosphere and poison our rivers, all without even carrying out an environmental impact assessment. Hundreds of tenants were evicted, the most vulnerable were bullied, threatened, and some they even tried to send to live in hotels. Our campaign involved supporting those tenants, putting together a case for retrofitting the tower blocks, countering Wheatley's lies and beating them in court once and taking them to the Court of Session, holding a public ballot of every community member in the Wynford and winning with a landslide, and numerous direct actions, including occupying the tower blocks. We drew on the support and expertise of top architects, experts in retrofitting, carbon capture, VAT, ecologists, environmental and social activists, and homelessness campaigners. We may not have saved the tower blocks, but we forced them to concede 85% of the new properties will be for social rent, not their originally planned 0%. And we ensured a replacement for our community centre. We gave Wheatley such a headache and caused them so much time and money, we may have delayed the gentrification of the north of Glasgow for decades to come. In the time that the Wynford tower blocks stood empty, hundreds of people died in temporary accommodation in Scotland. 67 women died in hotels and B&Bs of the kind that have broken the law thousands of times over by being unsuitable, unhealthy, unclean, and often dangerous, especially for women. In Glasgow, there are currently 424 women stuck in mixed-sex hotels, lacking proper amenities, security or oversight, vulnerable to theft, physical attacks, sexual predation and exploitation. There are also 108 families with children. We desperately need specific, safe accommodation for homeless women and children with wraparound care that meets their needs, and the Scottish Tenants Organisation will continue to campaign for those services despite ideological opposition from the Housing Minister, Mary McCallan, whose staff told us that they don't agree with that model. The SNP and the Greens and Labour are committed to pursuing a model whereby the Wheatley Group dictates housing policy, where public money is spent to deplete our public housing stock, where hundreds die in profiteering hotels while perfectly good buildings that could be retrofitted are destroyed. The Wheatley Group is a monster that must be destroyed. We need a mass programme of council house building, a national housing company, and we need decent functioning homeless services that protect the most vulnerable in society. So I urge the Workers' Party Scotland to endorse the Scottish Tenants Organisation's manifesto, a 20-point plan to burst the housing bubble, bring down rents and solve Scotland's shameful homelessness crisis. Thank you.
Incredible. She is a Mary Barber in the making. She's, after she made that speech, I said to a few that were gathered around, we have to get her into the Workers' Party. She's one of the most inspiring young politicians in the making that I have met. And I was so glad when she agreed to speak at the launch in the Pearce Institute, which of course in Glasgow has its own wonderful historic legacy. But she is incredible, and it's because she knows her business. She has got all the statistics and the horrors and of the people who have been homeless or threatened with homelessness. And more important than anything else, she has the trust of these people. So we are really blessed to have her in our ranks. And as I say, that performance that she gave has had so many hits because she's clear, incisive, and you can tell that not only is she speaking or coming from a place of knowledge, she's speaking from the heart as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think again it's a real travesty that this hasn't been picked up by any of our press, by any of our mainstream media. You know, it doesn't. How long would it take to? I mean, we had our we've had the candidate. You know, fair enough. I understand it's a concern about the Guga hunt. You know, the guy that's coming running in Edinburgh Central dressed up as a bird to draw attention to the Guga hunt. You know, but you know, it's a shame that these birds are getting killed and have been for like however long it is, 100 odd years or something or more. But you know, people don't have houses. People who have got housing are being exploited in poor housing and with high rents by, you know, capitalist profiteers. Essentially BlackRock, essentially, and that's a big story. And I think the public engagement on Laura's video shames a lot of our media, especially our so-called left-wing and liberal media that are supposedly interested in these issues. They've had about 4 or 5 weeks now to pick up that story and run with it, and they've failed to do so. It's not like they've not been alerted to it. And like I say, the amount of engagement from people sharing their own stories of despair at the hands of the Wheatley Group, one has to ask the question, what is it about the Wheatley Group that makes it so difficult for them to be tackled by the Scottish press? And I think maybe if you scratch the surface there, you might find that there's all kinds of connections in terms of where capital reaches, really. And if it's not that, then it's just a complete failure on the part of those that are supposed to be covering these type of stories.
I don't know what's happened to Scottish journalism. I remember 50 years ago, I entered journalism. I'm coming up to the anniversary in September, and I'm not quite sure how to mark it. But Scottish journalism was considered the gold standard. That is what we all aspired to. The great writers all came from Scotland. The great editors, the opinion leaders, they all came from Scotland. And now I look at the state of Scottish journalism, and it really is in the gutter. The Scotsman used to be a paper on a par with the Times in terms of greatness, in terms of reputation, and it has just fallen into the gutter. Magnus Linklater was editor when I was, maybe 30 years ago, and he was a man who would walk into a room and he'd be instantly recognised and respected. I couldn't tell you who the editor of The Scotsman is now. No idea, but these great figures, statesman-like figures, have just gone. Mm-hmm. And you've got these terms like clickbait, and I went into a newsroom just a few months ago. There's no telephones. The telephones would be ringing off the hook, and there'd be a clatter, and maybe I'm just an old fart. I don't know, but I do. Well, your journalism literally got you held hostage by the Taliban. So that's maybe you've got quite a high bar of how far you're willing to go. I don't want to be defined for falling off a donkey, but yes, that's how I came to be arrested in Afghanistan. But I do despair at the state of journalism today.
It does seem, there's a lot to be said. I mean, the reliance on press releases is one thing. It's like that seems to be just part of the way that it is now. It's like, well, did you tell us about the story before we reported on it, sort of thing. Fair enough. This seems to be the way that they operate. But I think when you have a situation like this, when it is an election cycle and so much attention is being given to these corporate political bodies, these basically these companies that just run our political establishment, because that's what it is. I was saying to Chris Cullen yesterday, who's the Communist Party candidate. I had spoken to him at the May Day rally, and I was just reiterating that point that Sturgeon kept always using this term, that she was involved in frontline politics, but I always laugh when I hear this term because it's frontline management. That's what we've basically got. It's professional managerial class politicians, and that's the problem. But the political nadir is mirrored by our journalistic nadir as well of the Fourth Estate. Really, it's very obvious. There's very little appetite or desire to actually make an effort and go out and report on something out with that very narrow perimeters that they've got for the Scottish established parties, and that's to the detriment of the whole country. I think the whole of our society is suffering as a result of this, I think,
Well, journalism is under attack. I mean, not only overseas where journalists have become targets in Gaza, for instance, 250 killed by Israel, but journalism is under fire. It's almost a crime to want to be a journalist these days, and this is why, I mean, the growth of podcasts like this is so important, and online news services now like the Canary and the Mill and other online news services are doing quite well because people are desperate to hear the truth and they're just not getting it. Even when, this week there have been 3 Ukrainian male models in court facing arson charges on properties linked to Keir Starmer, and no one is any the wiser of what is going on in the Old Bailey. Nobody knows.
No.
Because the mainstream media are just not covering it. And, you have to wonder why.
We do have a rather suffocating, almost a sort of concerning, dystopian, Orwellian sense pervading through our entire media and social discourse since we've had the Zionist rampage on Gaza. It's clear that there is huge tentacles of Zionist capital reaching into every facet of our public lives. You yourself have been an ardent campaigner for Palestinian liberation as well. You actually were on the flotilla and were one of the people you were arrested. Were you on that flotilla?
Yes.
Can you tell me a bit about that? What was your experience of that?
Well, that was traumatic. We were, our boat was stopped, boarded by the Israelis, and I did tell them, as spokesman of the ship, I did tell them in quite a clear manner that, and I wasn't hysterical, I just said, what you were doing is against international law. You were boarding a ship without permission. This is an act of piracy. And by taking us hostage, you are committing war crimes. Do you understand? And it was just a shrug of the shoulder, and they boarded the boat. Took us against our will to Ashdod. And then tried to charge us and get us to sign papers to say that we had entered Israel illegally. And I said, no, we were kidnapped and taken on a boat. Well, if you don't sign, you'll go into prison for 8 years. And I said, well, I can't sign something that I haven't done. And this is a rogue state which has no respect for international law. And I do believe the actions of the Israeli state have now led to some terrible crimes against Jewish people living elsewhere in the world. I know that the Jewish community in Britain is still reeling from the fact that two Jewish people were stabbed in Golders Green. But what, again, the media didn't tell us was before those two Jewish men were stabbed, a Muslim man had been stabbed, and he's still in hospital. But that wasn't talked about. And then this terror attack was carried out by a man who was clearly disturbed and had mental issues, had a history of violence using knives. He'd just come out of treatment. I think that his story will be one of catastrophic failure as well. And I can trace all of that back to the days of Margaret Thatcher, when she destroyed care in the community. And there, I don't want people to go around feeling unsafe, but there are all sorts of people with mental issues who should not be walking the streets. And I've got a Jewish friend who's really distressed by this crime in Golders Green. And she said, it's just not safe for me to go to the synagogue or wear or do anything overtly Jewish. And I can sympathise with that situation. I'm a Muslim, but people say, well, you don't look like one. And I say, well, what does a Muslim look like? But of course, it's the hijab. And I don't wear a hijab. One of the reasons is I don't want to be a walking target for any nutcase who listens to some hate speech, most of it coming out of Westminster these days, and then they're triggered by the sight of a woman wearing a hijab. And the amount of Muslim women who are targeted is alarming as well.
Well, it does seem to be a disproportionate response to whenever there's an anti-Semitic or perceived anti-Semitic attack, when there's ever some type of Islamophobic sort of situation. There seems to be a bit disproportionate there, Tell me, you're standing for Cathcart and Pollock. You've got 10 candidates. You've got 10 Workers' Party candidates throughout the country standing. How's your campaign been going? How do you feel it's been going?
I have thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and I've picked up some terrible swear words, but I have enjoyed the experience. I've always said and agreed with the well-known saying that Glasgow is its people, which somebody said, well, that's more an accusation than anything else. But
people make Glasgow.
Yes, and it is a fantastic city. And after I listened to Laura speaking, another of our candidates who's a local lass, Catherine McKernan, she took me round the city, and she was explaining about the blonde stone buildings, how they were built using local stone, and then when they ran out, they moved to the red stone, which was quarried in Galashiels, and moved to Glasgow. And then we started looking at all of these magnificent old buildings that are empty. There's one called the Egyptian Building.
I know it, yeah.
It's absolutely stunning from the outside, and that would make a great residential home. Maybe the Wheatley group that have been named and shamed by Laura could look at this as a great social housing project in the centre of Glasgow. And I think that we ought to look more at our older city centre buildings and repurpose them and turn them into accommodation.
Well, in Edinburgh, what's happening is they're getting knocked down and replaced by student flats, unfortunately. I think that's happening a lot in Glasgow as well now, as well.
Yes, I heard that there are these glass buildings that won't last 5 minutes that are going up all over the city, and they're charging £800 a month. I don't know any student that can afford £800 a month. These are obviously being built for the Trustafarians, and obviously everyone's welcome to the city to study, but £800 a month.
That's actually on the cheaper end of the spectrum,
yes,
compared to some of the ones that are in Edinburgh.
You know, we're looking after the elite, and we're not looking after the real people, the people who make Glasgow.
Yeah.
And this is, so I've really had my eyes opened in a way that because I've got great people like Catherine and Laura there who are advising, and I went to one of Laura's housing meetings because she's part of this Scottish Tenants
Union, yeah.
And I really felt a lump in my throat when she was describing some of the individual cases that she has dealt with. And then she named the housing minister, Mary McCallan, you know, who I looked into her background, and because I can't believe a female housing minister has sat and presided over this crisis in housing in Glasgow in particular, where women are afraid to go into the mixed hostels that they've been forced to live because of sexual assault, because all sorts of reasons to do with violence. And she is allowing this, and I'm looking into Mary's background thinking, you know, where's the sisterhood? Where's the anger? Where's the outrage? You know, instead of clutching her pearls and saying, oh, this is terrible, we'll do something, and then does absolutely nothing. And of course, her background is as a solicitor or lawyer.
Professional managerial class.
Absolutely. She sits in the boardrooms,
yeah.
You know, looking after her clients.
They're all the same. They're selected on this basis. This is corporate politics. It's replicated across the board by all these parties. And that's why until the electorate who still participate decide to actually do something different, or we can encourage people to join the electorate who currently are apathetic and don't engage at all, this is what we're going to be served up, an ever decreasing bland level of beige politics that doesn't actually change any of the material differences for people, and we're going to only end up with even more disastrous outcomes. The figures that Laura quoted there, the amount of people who had died, that's a disgrace, utterly disgraceful.
Well, people are dying in these rotten homes. They're dying on the streets, and nobody seems to care.
No.
And
I mean, I think our drug deaths figures alone, that that in itself is just absolutely, it's beyond. It doesn't. I can't get my head. It's always north of 1,000. You're basically going like every year, 1,000 people die, and that's it. There's nothing that doesn't matter. And never mind all the relative impacts that has on the families and the communities where these people are wasting away to that extent, or what's happening with them, or the social conditions. And there's those that don't die either, that are still blighted by these problems. I mean, there's a crack epidemic all over. You see the SNP's propaganda about Scotland and the positivity of Scotland. What about the crack epidemic that's working its way through our schemes? And
well, what I'd also like to look at, and I have no knowledge of this, so goodness knows who will upset with this, but this trendy solution of, let's have crack rooms, let's have safe places to inject and
managed addiction.
Yes, And I just think that this is not tackling the problem. And
It's creating a lot of jobs for middle class people.
well, it's a nice little earner if the trendier and more.
Well, if you get paid 80 grand a year, I think that you're helping the drugs problem by helping somebody find a vein in their arm, or like, you know what I mean, or pass them a lighter, or putting some ash on their crack pipe.
It's what next? And as I say, this is just my attitude as a completely sort of layperson from the outside looking in, but quite clearly these trendy solutions that they're doing are not working.
No.
And that is the reality.
I think Anne-Marie Ward, who was trying to advance her right to recovery bill, which I support, which I think is a good bill, she's made this point very clearly that in a lot of the places where these schemes were tried, they're actually shutting them down now because of the problems that it's had and the impacts that it's had on the areas. It ghettoises areas. It causes all kinds of problems when they do it. I think there is an argument for both. I think that. Having some type of safe consumption, but in tandem with some type of recovery program as well that's properly invested in, because it just seems strange, this idea that you would manage somebody long term with their drug addiction and not try to help them extricate themselves from it. What have you got? What's the story with Galloway then? How is the, obviously George is the leader. You're the leader of the Workers' Party Scotland, which you managed to get it called as the Workers' Party Scotland, because you're a big champion of independence, and George has apparently had his Damascene conversion as well, and he's now in favour of independence, and are you the person responsible for encouraging that?
I can't take credit, George is his own person, but I like to think that maybe I put a few little grains on the scales when he was weighing up the benefits of independence, and it's a crying shame that George is in exile at the moment. He's still keeping a close eye on what's happening with this election. He's also helping to mastermind the UK-wide election, because in England and Wales there are council elections, and the Workers' Party is hoping to get a few people elected under its banner over there. But he's in exile, and until the UK government apologises and gives him and his wife assurances of their safety, he's said that he's no intention of coming back, because he's worried about the security of his wife and family. And I can see that, his show, the mother of all talk shows, Moat, his show has millions of followers, and it's incredibly powerful and incredibly popular, because he is broadcasting twice a week, talking about global politics, and the authorities hate it, absolutely hate it. But he is beyond their draconian restrictions. Ofcom can't pull the plug on Moat, and as much as they'd like to, the British government can't pull the plug on Moat. So he continues to broadcast from wherever he finds himself. And last year, when he's got a home in Scotland, when he was living in Scotland, last year he flew into Gatwick, and he and his wife were arrested by armed police under something called Schedule 7. And they were held for quite a few hours and questioned separately. The biggest activity was around his wife's fingernail, which was painted in the Palestinian flag. and what is that? Why did you pick those colours? And it was all sorts of questions over this fingernail. And when he finally was released, they took his telephone and laptop and refused to return it. He'll get it back eventually, but goodness knows what will have been put on to it since then. And he was quite shaken by this. And he knew, or he felt, that the arrest was a political arrest ordered by Shabana Mahmood, who was a former intern of his. And he said that he didn't want to feel unsafe. And somebody said to him, they're wanting to silence you, and next time they might take you, and you could be the next Julian Assange. And of course, this all sounds ridiculous in the cold light of day, but when you look around at people who have been targeted and silenced, and people like Craig Murray, who's also standing in Edinburgh, have been arrested and intimidated, and then they call you barking mad.
Yeah, I think it's undoubtedly anybody who has had the temerity to stand up in solidarity over this issue, if they've got a public profile, they're going to find themselves receiving some heat for it.
I'm surprised you haven't been targeted.
Well, I have in various ways.
We'll wait for the Rozzers to come charging in the middle of this broadcast.
We're on first name terms now, anyway. Tell me, right? So the votes on the 7th. You're Glasgow, Cathcart and Pollock. You're on the constituency and the list as well, are you?
Yes, You can vote twice for me.
Okay, well, you could certainly do worse than voting for yourself, Yvonne, in my opinion. And Laura is also on your list, is she?
Laura is on the list, and as I say, she is just such a tremendous asset.
Definitely.
And I think that 100 or so years down the line, people will still be will have forgotten about the woman who fell off the donkey in Afghanistan.
Just before you go, for those that don't know, Yvonne was held. I learned of you many years ago because you were on the news. I think the news at 10 or whatever, because you'd been held captive by the Taliban for about a week or two. And but what you're saying is. And we spoke about this earlier a little bit, that it was pretty hairy. You definitely had thought it was curtains that they were going to execute you at some point, right?
This is the power of propaganda. This is what happens when you read the Daily Express or write for it.
And tell me though, so what is the significance of the donkey though? That's how you led to get caught, is it?
Yes, after my undercover mission to find out what life was like under the Taliban regime, I then headed back to the Pakistan border on the back of a donkey. And
this is a truly biblical tale.
Well, yes, this particular donkey ride ended in disaster for me because I don't know if it realised it had an infidel on its back or not, but it just bolted. And it was stopped by a Taliban soldier, and the donkey bucked, and I went up into the air and crashed down to the ground, and
you were revealed.
And I was I wasn't at the time aware of it, but he was shouting at me and pointing at my camera, and it was the one piece of equipment that I'd taken into Afghanistan, and he wanted the camera, which was banned under the Taliban. I mean, they were quite a joyless lot, the Model 1s. Taliban 2 aren't much better, I have to say, over education, but he wanted the camera, and so I handed it over, and then I stood back waiting to be shot. And I was wearing the all-enveloping blue burqa, and when I opened my eyes, he'd gone. He'd, lost interest in me, and he went off to find out who had hired the donkey. And I was just, some no-mark woman. He wanted to find out who had paid for the donkey, and that's how they arrested my 2 guides.
Okay.
So it was. I managed to carry on my journey because nobody realised I was a Westerner. And when I looked back, I saw my guides were surrounded by men and they'd been arrested. And I just thought, oh, shit, I can't leave them. I can't leave them.
So you went back and you were arrested as well? Is that what happened?
Well, I tried to break through this crowd to, stop the arrest of the guides. And I was thrown back. Several times because this was man's business. It had nothing to do with a woman, and in the end I had to take my burqa off. I was wearing trousers and a dress, a shalwar kameez underneath, so I took off my burqa and just shouted very loudly in English, "Will somebody let me through?" And everybody stopped and looked. It was I don't know, like a Rangers fan maybe walking through the terraces of Celtic Park. It was just like, what the hell? And it was like the parting of the Red Sea. And I walked through to this soldier to demand my camera back. And I thought this will be a useful distraction. And I threw a glance towards my 2 guides, and I thought they would be looking back thinking, oh, what a brave woman. And instead they looked at me as if to say, yeah, we were in trouble before, but now we're in serious trouble.
That's really torn it.
Yeah. So I just realised that was the worst possible thing that I could have done. And fast forward, I was held for 10, 11 days. But during that whole experience, what I learned was that the most powerful weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And that was me. All the fear that I had was manufactured up here.
Yeah.
And gleaned from headlines from the tabloid press. And every day I thought I was going to die. Every single day I would wake up thinking, is this my last day? All because of this manufactured propaganda and fear. And in fact, the Taliban turned out to be a bunch of sweeties. They were more afraid of me than, and when they finally did release me, I don't know who was happiest, them or me. It was like, thank God we've got rid of this horrible woman, because there was a complete clash of cultures. They just saw me as everything that was evil and bad in the West, and I saw them as everything that was evil and bad in the East. And it was only after the experience that that I was able to realise that they weren't the evil, brutal regime that Tony Blair and George Bush tried to convince us they were.
And no doubt people weren't overly enthusiastic to hear that version of them either from you, were they?
No, not at all. There was a big scramble for my story. And as soon as I said I was treated with courtesy and respect, I was almost removed from the TV cameras and not allowed to speak again. And of course I've been called barking mad, I've been demonised, and all sorts thrown at me. But, I'm still standing.
Still standing, and you're standing in Cathcart and Pollock.
Yes, a nice segue.
Yvonne, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. It seemed only appropriate to return the favour as you invited me along to your great opening for the Workers' Party. I hope it goes well for you and the rest of your candidates. I think people could do a lot worse than vote for the Workers' Party, considering some of the options that they've got there. And I think that some of your policies are great. They're very socialist policies, as far as I'm concerned, on housing and welfare and whatnot. So I think people should take a look at your manifesto. There's a few comments here. I didn't get a chance to look at them. Anyone? I've got this here. 1 second. Anyone who was an actual threat to the British state would have been harassed, cancelled and taken out like Willie McRae. The SNP are not a threat, they are a British state asset, says Nick Gethins. Howdy BPB. Ali Channel says, thanks for being such a strong female role model, Yvonne. And over here, Matt says, Scotland doesn't have a drug deaths problem, Scotland has an addiction problem. Labelling it a drugs death problem is a deliberate swindle by the SNP to switch the focus to a metric they can easily reduce. Disgraceful. So there's some opinions here. Paul Carr says, up the workers. Up the workers. Right, Yvonne, thanks so much for joining me. If anybody else is watching me just now, you can tune back in at 6:30 this evening for a special What the Election Selection, where I'll be looking back over the last month of campaigning and playing some great music and getting a blether with the regular What the X attendees. But until then, just like to say thanks to everybody that's joined us just now. And big thanks to Yvonne Ridley, and best of luck for the forthcoming vote on Thursday.
Well, thank you, and good luck to you as well.